So the Azure portal provide a graphical user interface for managing Azure subscriptions and services, and in many cases they are the primary management tools for service provisioning and operations. However, it is common for organizations to strive to automate their IT processes by creating reusable scripts or by combining the management of Azure resources with the management of other networks and infrastructure services. Now, Windows PowerShell provides a scripting platform for managing Windows and can be extended to a wide range of other infrastructure elements, including Azure, by leveraging modules of encapsulated code called as commandlets. So this particular lesson will explore how we can use Windows PowerShell to connect to an Azure subscription and to provision and manage Azure services. So after completing this lesson, we will be able to identify the Azure modules for Windows PowerShell. We will be able to explain the difference between Azure AD authentication and certificate authentication. We will be able to identify the Windows PowerShell commandlets used for classic deployment model and for Azure Resource Manager, and eventually we will be able to understand how we can use Azure PowerShell or Windows PowerShell to manage Azure platform. So starting with Azure PowerShell modules, you can implement several modules for Windows PowerShell to enable the administration of Azure by using Windows PowerShell. So when we talk about Azure PowerShell provides support for services called as Azure Resource Manager, Service Management, that is your classic model, and Azure Storage. So you first have to go ahead and install Azure PowerShell. Basically, it will import the PowerShell module for Azure into your local Windows PowerShell, from wherein you can go ahead and type in commands such as install module Azure RM or install module Azure, which will import the commandlets to download the modules and install them into Windows PowerShell. After that, you also can go ahead and if you are working on Azure Active Directory, there is a separate module for Azure AD as well, which is called as an Azure AD module for Windows PowerShell. So if you plan to manage users, groups and other services of Azure AD from Windows PowerShell, you could install the Azure Active Directory v2 PowerShell module. The module is available from the PowerShell gallery, and you can install it by running commandlet like install module name Azure AD and provide the version of it. Alternatively, you can use the Azure AD module for Windows PowerShell at the time. If you do not want to use the commandlet, you can go ahead and download that particular PowerShell module from an online link. In the similar way that you will download the Azure PowerShell module. In the same way, you can download Azure AD module. Moving on to Azure Automation Authoring Toolkit. So Azure Automation is a service that you can use to run Windows PowerShell workflows and scripts as runbooks directly inside the Azure environment, either on demand or based on a particular schedule. So while it is possible to develop Azure Automation runbooks directly in the Azure portal, you can also use Windows PowerShell for this particular purpose. To simplify the process of developing runbooks in the Windows PowerShell ISE, you can install the Azure Automation Authoring Toolkit from the PowerShell gallery by using the commandlet, that is install module Azure Automation Toolkit scope current user, and install Azure Automation ISE add-on. Moving on to understand how does authentication to Azure happens using PowerShell. So after you install the Azure PowerShell module, you need to connect it to the Azure subscription that you would want to manage with it. You can take two approaches to accomplish this. One is Azure AD authentication and certificate based authentication. When you talk about Azure AD authentication, you can use it to sign in to Azure account by using credentials, for example your Microsoft account which is associated with Azure subscription, or an organizational account that is defined in Azure AD. In the Azure Resource Manager deployment model, to connect an Azure account to the local Windows PowerShell environment, you can use commandlet called as login Azure RM account. This will basically open up a browser window in which the user can interactively sign into the Azure by entering a valid username and password. Azure AD authentication is based on access tokens. After signing in, the user remains authenticated until the authentication token expires. However, Azure AD facilitates an automatic refresh mechanism via a refresh token. So after you authenticate, you can use the get Azure RM context commandlet to view the current user account, the corresponding Azure AD tenant, and the Azure subscription associated with the current Windows PowerShell session. The get Azure RM subscription commandlet provides a subscription specific subset of this information. So if you have multiple subscriptions, you can set the current subscription by using the set Azure RM context commandlet with the name or ID of the subscription that you want to use. To save the current authentication information to reuse it in another Windows PowerShell session, you can use Save Azure RM Profile. The other type of authentication is certificate-based authentication. So most tools that are used to manage Azure also support Azure AD authentication. Generally, we recommend using Azure AD authentication as the primary authentication mechanism. However, in some cases, it might be more appropriate to authenticate by using certificates. For example, this allows you to run your script unattended by eliminating interactive authentication prompts without having to provide secure storage for the Azure AD user credentials. Specifics of implementing certificate-based authentication depend on whether you intend to interact with the Azure Service Management or Azure Resource Manager deployment model. Azure Service Management commandlets support the use of management certificates. Once you generate such a certificate, you need to store its private key in the certificate store within the profile of the user or computer account. Now from within this account security key, you can run your scripts. You will need to upload the corresponding public key into the target subscription where Azure Resource Manager, wherein you can. So the process basically involves one, to generate a certificate. Then you have to create an Azure AD application associated with the certificate. Then you have to create an Azure AD service principal associated with Azure AD application, and then you grant the service principal the reader role to the application. Other than that, you can also use an Azure generated certificate in the classic deployment model. So an Azure Management Certificate is an X509 v3 certificate that associates a client application or service with an Azure subscription. You can use Azure Generated Management Certificate, or you can generate your own by using your organization's public key infrastructure solution or a tool such as MakeCert. To use an Azure Generated Certificate in Windows PowerShell, you can run the commandlet such as get publish settings file, which will open a web browser in which you can sign in to your Azure account and then download a certificate file. After the file downloads, use the import publish settings file commandlet to store the certificate securely in your local certificate store. Furthermore, let's move on and talk about the various Azure PowerShell commandlets that you can use in either classic deployment or in the Azure Resource Manager model. So after you connect to your Windows PowerShell environment, you can use Azure subscription to create various resources by typing in various commands in regards to classic and resource manager model. So the commandlets you will use depend on the deployment model used to provision the resources. There are two different deployment models. One is the Azure Classic Deployment model and the other one is the Azure Resource Manager model. So the Azure Classic Deployment model uses the Azure module for Windows PowerShell, whereas the Azure Resource Manager model uses the Azure RM module for Windows PowerShell. As you can see on this slides, you can very easily use these particular commands to provision such resources. You can easily distinguish between the two modules, as Azure Resource Manager commandlets include the Azure RM string. For example, as you can see, for creating a VM, in the classic model you use the commandlet new Azure VM. In the Resource Manager model, you use a commandlet called as new Azure RM VM. So now after this, we are going to see a demonstration wherein how we can use Azure PowerShell to create a resource group, to create a storage account, and how do we delete resource group with its resources.